Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. For those who don't know, I am Matthew Silverman, Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our lecture with Professor Malka Z Simkovich, who will be exploring the Cairo Genizah from Synagogue Storeroom to Scholarly Revolution. Thank you to our generous sponsors for helping bring this program to our community, Judith Mazo, Edie and Art Hessel, and Rhoda Ritzenberg and Kenneth Heitner, who are sponsoring in recognition of Elaine Amir's leadership of the Haberman Institute. We also extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our fall 2025 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. Sponsoring lectures is a meaningful way to honor or remember a loved one or to mark a significant occasion such as a yahrzeit, a personal or professional achievement, or a milestone celebration. Your sponsorship donations, as well as contributions at all levels, allow us to continue offering these lectures free of charge for all participants. Our next program is The Dead Sea Sectarians, a Righteous Remnant in a Fallen World, with Professor Maxine Grossman. This program will be a great follow-up to today's, as both explore texts that were lost to time and their discovery transformed our understanding of Jewish history. For more information on this program and how to get involved, please visit our website. As always, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Kindly keep them as concise as possible and in complete sentences. They will be addressed at the end of the presentation, though you can submit them at any point. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Professor Simkovich is the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Publication Society and visiting professor at Yeshiva University's Revel Graduate School for Jewish Studies. Previously, she served as the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and Director of Catholic Jewish Studies at Catholic Theological Union from 2014 to 2024. Her first book, The Making of Jewish Universalism, From Exile to Alexandria, was published in 2016, and her second book, Discovering Second Temple Literature, The Scriptures and Stories That Shaped Early Judaism, was published in 2018 and received the 2019 AJL Judaica Reference Honor Award. Her third book, Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity, was published in June 2024. She is the author of over 100 published articles, including pieces that have been published in journals such as the Harvard Theological Review, the Journal for the Study of Judaism, Tablet, the Jewish Review of Books, and the Christian Century. And with that, I now welcome Professor Simkovich to join us.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I really appreciate your gracious introduction. And I also want to thank the sponsors of tonight's program, all of the organizers. It takes a lot of work to put together something like this. And I also appreciate all of you who are joining tonight at the end of your long day. It means a lot that all of you are here, and I'm looking forward to learning with you. All right, so I'm going to start in an unexpected place. You might know that the Cairo Genizah contains hundreds of thousands of fragments that were collected beginning in the 11th century all the way until the end of the 19th century. But I'm actually going to start this talk by saying a few words about the Second Temple era, the era that begins with the construction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in 515 BCE and ends in 70 CE with the fall of the temple. And I begin with this era, an era that I'm very subjective about. Is the era that I study. I do think it's the most important period in Jewish history, or maybe one of the most, because it bridges the world of the Hebrew Bible with the world of the rabbis, the rise of Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. And we do know a lot about this era, the centuries leading up to Hellenism and beyond. We know a lot about this era, particularly the final 3 centuries of the Second Temple period, And when we think about this period, very often we think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which hopefully you will learn more about when you come to the Haberman Institute's upcoming class with Dr. Maxine Grossman. Um, the Dead Sea Scrolls are very, very famous, and the drama involved in their discovery and their publication is relatively well known. They were discovered in the late 1940s and early 1950s. At that point, scholars learned of a massive cache of thousands of documents, but only 950 distinctive separate texts that were discovered in the Judean desert on the northwestern corner of the Dead Sea. And it took many decades for these documents to be published. Now, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls changed the way that we think about Jewish practice and thought in the late Second Temple era, this very, very important period. But the Dead Sea Scrolls get a lot of face time. And the truth is that they represent not just a very small minority of Jews who lived in the end of the Second Temple era, but really an extreme subset of a sectarian community. They were probably members of a sect called the Essenes, and there might have been 100, 150 people who lived in their community. So the truth is that the Dead Sea Scrolls, while very famous, tells us actually rather little about the 600 years or so of the Second Temple era, very little about what scholars call common Judaism, that is, the kind of Judaism that the vast majority of Jews practiced, the kind of Judaism that goes well beyond the world of the sectarians, the kind of Judaism that Jews in Antioch, in Syria, and in Alexandria, in Egypt, and elsewhere practiced. The truth is that in many ways, there is a collection of texts that is actually more significant for our understanding of the Second Temple era, and that is the Cairo Genizah. A Genizah is a storage area where Jews place sacred books, typically documents with God's name written on them in Hebrew. According to Jewish tradition, such sacred texts cannot be disposed of in the typical manner. They need to be stored. Very commonly, these genizot are stored either in a synagogue or in a cemetery and buried to the side. The Cairo Genizah is a collection not of 950 distinct texts, as with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but really a mind-boggling number. It's around, although we can't know for sure, but it's somewhere between 300 and 400,000 fragments. I mean, this is again, it's really hard to mentally compute that number. These fragments were parts of various, many thousands of documents that were produced and stored over the course of about 1,000 years, again, beginning in the 11th century and all the way up until the 19th century. But even that is not quite accurate, because while Jews in Cairo began to store their sacred texts in their Genizah in the 11th century, some of these texts are actually much, much older. So the Genizah that I'm going to be talking about tonight was discovered in 1896 in a storeroom of this synagogue, the Ben Ezra Synagogue. And at this time, when the Genizah was first established in the medieval era, Cairo was a hub for Jewish activity, and the neighborhood in which the Genizah was built is known as Fustat. This was an administrative center for Cairo's Jewry, and this neighborhood actually had 3 major synagogues and other small ones. Before we discuss what was found in the Genizah and why I think the Genizah is so important, not just for our understanding of medieval Jewish life, but also of Second Temple Judaism and ancient Judaism, I want to complicate a phrase that is often used, and that phrase is the discovery of the Cairo Genizah. The word discovery denotes that the scholars involved in this story found something that local Jews did not know existed, and that's just simply not the case. There was no discovery. Yes, it's true, modern scholars learned about the astonishing size of the Genizah and were eager to gain access to it. But locals knew about it for many centuries. And so I would rather use the term perhaps recovery or publication, but not a discovery. And even the word Genizah is actually a little bit inaccurate because this is not a standard Genizah for a number of reasons. First of all, most Genizot contain sacred texts that, as I said, have God's name written on them in Hebrew, but this Genizah is much more expansive. It holds documents that were written in Hebrew that do not have God's name on it. And scholars think that this is because the community of Jews living in Cairo, especially those living in the medieval era, believed that Hebrew was so inherently holy that anything written in Hebrew could not be disposed of. Anything that had Hebrew on it had to be stored and put to the side, not thrown away. And therefore, we have a treasure trove of documentation over the course of 1,000 years. We have business contracts, we have marriage dowries, poetry, personal letters, all kinds of things that one would typically not find in a Genizah. And it's also not a classical Genizah in the sense that it was not left untouched for 1,000 years, even though those involved in the publication of the Genizah fragments presented the Genizah as being totally untouched for 1,000 years. It's not true. The Genizah was in a synagogue that had just been rebuilt before scholars from England showed up and emptied its contents. Between 1889 and 1892, the synagogue was completely reconstructed and a new Genizah room was built. And so you could see in this picture that I show you, this does not look particularly ancient, actually. This is the newer version of the Ben Ezra synagogue. And when the synagogue was renovated between 1889 and 1892, they built a big, beautiful Genizah room, and scholars believe that material from other Genizot in Cairo was added to this Genizah. So Cairo had many Genizot, and after 1892, things were shuffled around and many fragments were added to this Genizah in particular. So it's really hard to know what the provenance is of many of these texts, where they come from, when they ended up in the Genizah, had they been sitting there for 1,000 years, or maybe just 5 years before they were discovered. These are really complicated questions. So to sum up so far, the Cairo Genizah was distinctive and really remarkable in contrast to other Genizot in a couple of ways. First of all, its sheer size, 300 to 400,000 fragments, is just, again, astonishing in quantity. And also, the contents are expansive because this Genizah, unlike others, includes a massive and diverse range of texts, not just in terms of what we might call non-sacred texts, but also documents that were composed many centuries before they were copied onto other pieces of parchment and paper and stored in the Genizah. So the discovery of the Hebrew manuscripts in the Genizah that were originally composed in the Second Temple era helped scholars to realize that many of the ancient Jewish works that they thought were originally written in Greek and were Hellenized were originally written in Hebrew. In other words, when scholars discovered certain Hebrew texts in the Genizah, they realized that some ancient Jewish texts that they thought had been written in Greek originally actually had a Hebrew original. And this might sound very uninteresting and technical and not important, but it's of huge significance. And this is what I want to focus on tonight. Until 1896, most scholars thought that when it came to ancient Judaism, there were two streams of Jewish identity, two opposing cultures. And each of these opposing cultures were represented in two languages. There was the traditional Judaism represented by authentic Hebrew literature and scriptures. And then there was a Hellenized form of Judaism, one might call a more corrupted form of Judaism, represented by Jewish texts written in Greek. And scholars believe that these Greek Jewish texts were written by Hellenized Jews who were enamored of Greek philosophy and wisdom traditions, and that these streams of traditions were largely separated. And not only that, but by the end of the Second Temple era, so these scholars believed, many Jewish documents written in Hebrew represented a Judean outlook that was highly ritualistic, focused on the Jerusalem temple, purity laws, and sacrifice. And this kind of focus on purity and ritual contrasted with a more open, universalist, again, Hellenized outlook that we find in Greek texts written by Jews. These texts are more focused on ethical content and philosophy and wisdom and so on. So again, we have this binary. We will find that it's a false binary, but we have this perception that Jewish life in the Hellenistic era is kind of divided according to language, with Hebrew-speaking Jews or Aramaic-speaking Jews in Judea being more focused on cult and ritual and purity and legalism, and then a more Hellenized version of Judaism that perhaps is less connected to its authentic traditions. The recovery of the Cairo Genizah totally debunks this false binary, because as soon as scholars realize that there are documents that they thought were originally Greek, but in fact they were written in Hebrew, they have to totally rethink what it meant to live as a Hebrew or Aramaic speaking Jew in Judea in the Hellenistic era. So what I'm going to do is say a little bit about the early years in which scholars begin to realize what's happening in Cairo, and the fact that there is this treasure trove in this synagogue, the Ben Ezra Synagogue. In the 1880s and the early 1890s, scholars from Oxford and Cambridge are buying fragments from Egypt that are coming to them through third-party collectors and various scholars. And these ancient Jewish fragments that are coming in from Cairo, they're entering into Oxford and Cambridge at a trickle, inconsistently, and with mysterious origins. And it's really not clear to the scholars in Oxford and Cambridge where these fragments are coming from, but you have figures like Solomon Wertheimer and Greville John Chester, who are managing as kind of liaisons between these libraries and dealers in Cairo and elsewhere in Egypt. But there's a total lack of clarity about where these fragments actually come from. And I'd love to focus more on this. It's very, very interesting, but I'm not going to, because we don't have time. I do recommend that you look at the scholarship of Dr. Rebecca Jefferson, who's written very well on this. She has a lot of articles available online and on her academia.edu page. But my focus is going to be on how the recovery of one fragment that came from the Genizah, a fragment that was identified by Solomon Schechter in May of 1896, changed our understanding of early Judaism. The discovery of this one fragment produces a domino effect of events that leads to the emptying of the entire Genizah. And this discovery, like I said, it changes our understanding of the foundations, of the origins of what ultimately will be rabbinic normative Judaism. And here's how it happened. It begins with two women, sisters from Scotland, Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlop Gibson. These women are sisters. They are identical twins. They are orphaned at the age of 23, and their father leaves them a massive fortune. They are not married. They are not Jewish. They are Presbyterian. They both get married. It's very, very strange how their lives parallel one another. They're extremely close. Their husbands both die at a very young age, and neither of them have children when their husbands die. Perhaps most importantly, in addition to the fact that they are single and wealthy and have nobility and also mobility, they can move around because they don't have families and they have a lot of resources. But above all, what's important to know about Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlop Gibson is that they are self-taught scholars. They don't use their fortune to go to the beach and read their magazines. They teach themselves ancient languages, and of course they hire tutors as well. They study the New Testament. They're very pious Christian women. They want to read ancient scriptures in their original languages, so they learn Hebrew to study their Old Testament. They learn Greek to study their New Testament. They learn Syriac and other dialects of Aramaic, so they can read other ancient texts. And especially Agnes Smith Lewis, who ultimately was honored with honorary doctorates at the end of her life, and she finds all kinds of fascinating manuscripts in the Sinai Desert. But both of these women really deserve to be remembered as serious scholars. They use their fortune, like I said, to travel, to explore, but they're not just exploring, they're looking for information that will provide them with context about the biblical past. And this brings them to Cairo in the spring of 1896. They are buying from dealers on the street, from people selling their wares. They're buying fragments and shards and items that look ancient to them. And one of the things that they buy in Cairo in 1896 is a tiny, small Hebrew fragment. Agnes Smith Lewis, of the two sisters, has very good Hebrew, but she doesn't know what this fragment signifies. It looks very ancient, but she can't verify it. And she doesn't know what broader text it comes from. And so she says, we have to find a scholar of Hebrew to identify this fragment. Here's the fragment. And you could see that it's in Hebrew. You could see it looks ancient, but it's not clear what this fragment is. So she says, okay, I have to find someone to identify this fragment, and I know just the person. He's a professor of rabbinics at Cambridge University in England, and he will know what this is, and this is Solomon Schechter. So Margaret Dunlop Gibson and her sister Agnes Smith Lewis go home, and they bring the fragment to Solomon Schechter. They meet with him in person. They show him this fragment, and they say, "Is this anything? What is this? What is this document from?" Schechter recalls this moment in later writings, and he says that when he saw the fragment, he almost passed out in shock. He struggled to not faint. He was so blown away by what he was holding in his hands. And what is he holding? He's holding a document that he always thought existed but never had proof. And it is the Hebrew version of a document known by different names. Some people call it Ben Sira, others call it Sirach, Ecclesiasticus. It's all the same document. This is a wisdom text that had only survived in Greek. It, if you could see my screen, is preserved in the Apocrypha. It's considered to be sacred in the Catholic tradition, scriptural, but it only survived in Greek. However, it is cited in rabbinic literature. It's the only non-canonical book. So it's the only book that's not in the Hebrew Bible that is cited as authoritative by rabbis, not just once, but multiple times in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Jerusalem Talmud, in other early rabbinic midrashic collections. Ben Sira is cited by the rabbis as a very important work. And they cite phrases here and there, but by the 19th century, there is no document of Hebrew Ben Sira. It only exists in Greek. And scholars who are mostly coming out of Protestant traditions, scholars treated Ben Sira as reflective not of a Hebrew-speaking Judean culture, but of a Greek-speaking Hellenized Jewish society. And so they were reading Ben Sira as reflective of a very Hellenized outlook and not reflective, again, of a more pietistic Hebrew-speaking culture. So he has found a Hebrew version of Ben Sira. I'll read to you the words that he sees in Hebrew. But you could look at the English. If you understand Hebrew, you'll appreciate the poetry, the beauty of these lines. Harimu kolchem ubarchu yachtav v'hodu ladonai al kol ma'asav bishirot nevel uchle minim v'chein tomru batrua masei el kulam tovim l'chol tzorech b'ito yaspik. Okay, proclaim the greatness of his name, loudly sing his praises with music on the harp and all stringed instruments. Sing out with joy as you proclaim the works of God are all of them good. He supplies for every need in its own time. Now, I want to say a little bit more about what Ben Sira signified and how scholars understood the book to really appreciate what a big deal this is. I mentioned that Ben Sira only existed in its Greek translation. And in the Greek translation, there is a prologue. And the prologue tells us that the person who produced this Greek translation was translating an older Hebrew document, and that this Hebrew document was written by the translator's grandfather, Yeshua. So the Greek version of Ben Sira is very clear about its provenance. The writer says, I am a Judean Jew, and my grandfather produced this very important book of wisdom about the Torah, the law, and the prophets. And I'm translating it into Greek so that Jews who don't speak Hebrew can understand it. This is what we find when we open up a Greek version of Ben Sira. Many great teachings have been given to us through the law and the prophets. So the Greek would be nomos, which really should be Torah and prophets. It shouldn't be law. But the books of the Torah, the books of the prophets, and the others that follow them. And for these, we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom. Now, those who read the scriptures must not only themselves understand them, but as lovers of learning, be able through the spoken and written word to help the outsiders. My grandfather, Yeshua, who had devoted himself to the reading of the Torah and the prophets and the other books, and had acquired proficiency in them, was led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom, so that by becoming familiar also with his book, those who love learning might make even greater progress in living according to the law. By the way, for those of you who know that the Hebrew Bible is divided today into three parts, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, this statement is the earliest attestation that we have to a tripartite Bible. The law, the prophets, and the other books that followed them, that indicates a three-section Hebrew Bible, or a Tanakh, and this is the earliest reference we have to that. So the Greek version of Ben Sira identifies itself as a translation of an earlier Hebrew version. And the translator says, I came to Egypt in the 38th year of one of the Ptolemaic kings. This would put us in the late 2nd century BCE. I found opportunity for no little instruction. It seemed necessary that I devote diligence and labor to translating this book. I applied my skill day and night to complete and publish the book for those living abroad, those Jews living in Egypt who wish to gain learning and are disposed to live according to the law. Now, scholars did not take this prologue seriously. They did not, for the most part, believe that there was a Hebrew original hiding behind the Greek text. They read this Greek version of Ben Sira as posing as a text that was originally composed in Hebrew, but that was a Hellenized wisdom work that could never have been written by a Jew speaking a Semitic language like Hebrew or Aramaic and living in the land of Israel. They treated Greek Ben Sira as a later text that was faking it. They didn't read this text in conversation with early rabbinic Judaism. They treated it as a Hellenized work. Even though the truth is, there was a lot of evidence to look at Ben Sira as a Hebrew text. In addition to the fact that the rabbis cite Ben Sira, again, in the Babylonian Talmud, the Palestinian Talmud, Midrashic texts, the Greek version of Ben Sira has what we call Semiticisms. It has awkward phrases in the Greek that when you reverse translate into Hebrew, sounds very smooth. And yet, scholars, for the most part, especially Christian scholars from the Protestant tradition, did not treat Ben Sira as part of what we would call the proto-rabbinic tradition. And so when Schechter finds this fragment of Ben Sira, he realizes that he can use this evidence to compel or argue to scholars that it is time for them to think and rethink and reevaluate their view of Judean life and thought in the land of Israel, and for them to reevaluate their understanding of Hellenistic Judaism. Was it really the case that you had these two streams of Judaism that are in tension, right? You have the Greek tradition of Hellenized Judaism and the very austere, ritualistic, pietistic Hebrew Jewish tradition. Schechter says, no, there's more harmony between these cultures, and Ben Sira is part of this Hebrew tradition, even though it is a wisdom text. It is a text that embraces many aspects of Hellenistic thought. By the way, I think what's so interesting about this intuition that Schechter has is that he is vindicated. Maybe not in his lifetime. After Schechter's discovery, scholars continue to push back. They say, well, the Hebrew version that you found at the Cairo Genizah was a translation of the Greek. So it was originally written in Greek and then it was translated into Hebrew. And Schechter pushed against that and he said, no, it was originally written in Hebrew. However, once the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, he was proven to be correct because the Dead Sea Scrolls included Hebrew versions of Ben Sira that date to the 1st century BCE. In other words, that were written down in the 1st century BCE, preserved in those caves and discovered. So he was vindicated. And in 1965, a scroll of Ben Sira in Hebrew was discovered by Yigael Yadin in Masada. That is dated paleographically to the first half of the 1st century BCE. And so no one argues with Schechter today. It is totally agreed. Ben Sira was written in Hebrew by a Jew in the land of Israel and incorporates aspects of Hellenistic culture. So there wasn't this bifurcation between cultures that scholars had presumed. Now, in 5 seconds, Schechter intuits all of this because he's such a genius and he knows Jewish text like the back of his hand, and he knows Greek Ben Sira so well that as soon as he sees the Hebrew fragment, again, he's so brilliant that he realizes this is the original Ben Sira, the precursor to the Greek. And so look at this handwriting. Can you believe it? He could have been a doctor with this handwriting. Right after he sees the fragment, the sisters go home, and that night he writes Agnes a postcard. He writes her a note, and he says, don't do anything. Do not tell anyone about this fragment. Dear Mrs. Lewis, the fragment with me represents a piece of the original Hebrew of Ecclesiasticus, Ben Sira. It is the first time that such a thing was discovered. Please do not speak yet about the matter until tomorrow. I will come to you tomorrow at around 11 p.m. Scholars wonder if that's a typo and he meant to write a.m. But I don't know. Maybe he did want to go under the cover of night because he didn't want to be discovered, or maybe it's a typo. We don't know. But he writes, I will come to you tomorrow about 11 a.m. and talk over the matter with you to make the matter known in haste and great excitement. Yours sincerely, S. Schechter. So he is just overwhelmed with what this could mean and immediately sets about trying to figure out where this fragment came from. It's not enough to say, oh, I bought it at a bazaar or I bought it at a shuk from a dealer in the middle of Cairo. Schechter says, I have to find out where this came from so I could find the other fragments that comprise this document and figure out how I can use this for scholarly purposes. Now, he doesn't just write to Agnes Smith Lewis, he also writes to his friend, Judge Mayer Sulzberger, living in Philadelphia, a very well-known Jewish leader who happens to have had a lot of affiliations with my institution, the Jewish Publication Society, Schechter is very close, excuse me, very close with Judge Salzberger, and he writes him a postcard too, and he says, I met yesterday with a piece of good fortune, of which many a biblical scholar will be jealous. I've namely discovered among the fragments, which Mrs. Lewis, she had discovered something called the Syriac Gospel, an ancient text, an ancient version of the New Testament in the Aramaic dialect known as Syriac. Anyway, I've discovered among the fragments that, which Mrs. Lewis brought from her last journey in the Orient, a leaf from Hebrew Sirach. As you know, it was the original of the Apocryph. So he's talking about the apocryphal books that are part of the Catholic canon, but were written by Jews at the late Second Temple era. So it's part of the apocryphal text in the Hebrew. And the Gaonim, the rabbis in the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, even cite passages from it. But it is now for the first time that we have a fragment coming from the body of the book. I am now transcribing the manuscript and shall, in Yirtzeh Hashem, he writes in Hebrew, God willing, write a monograph on the subject, which I hope you will receive soon. That year, Schechter works very fast. He makes a plan to visit the Genizah, and he does. He goes to Cairo in 1896. He does what other collectors and scholars and bypassers were unable to do, which is he ingratiates himself to the Beadles and the administrators of the Ben Ezra Synagogue. He develops a relationship with them over the course of many weeks and somehow finagles permission to empty the Genizah. But before he does that, he writes about this fragment that he had received or that he had been shown by Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlop Gibson. And he writes an article called a fragment of the original text of Ecclesiasticus, where he is very explicit about what is at stake. And he writes, if it could be proved that Sirach is in the rabbinic idiom, which we're acquainted from the Talmudic literature, then, and this is very poetic, I appreciate this language, then between Ecclesiasticus and the books of the Old Testament, there must lie centuries, nay, there must lie in most cases the deep waters of the captivity. He's talking about the exile, the grave of the old Hebrew and the old Israel, and the womb of the new Hebrew and the new Israel. The assumption of Maccabean Psalms and many other hypotheses of Bible criticism would fall to the ground. In other words, Bible scholars, especially from the Protestant tradition, were dating wisdom texts that had been considered part of the Hebrew Bible. They were dating wisdom texts and Psalms very late. And they were presuming a chasm between early biblical texts that were part of the ritualistic, purity, temple-centered tradition, and they were separating those from later wisdom texts in the Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible. And these scholars said, well, anything that looks Hellenized, like Proverbs and the Psalms, these texts were written in the Hellenistic era in the 2nd century BCE, because there's no way that earlier Israelites or Judahites could have produced anything like this. And so these scholars who were separating the purity temple-centered traditions from the wisdom traditions suggested that there was this huge chasm that couldn't be bridged between these two streams. And Schechter says, if I could prove that Ben Sira was written in Hebrew, then this tendency to separate these two kinds of literature that are both preserved in the Hebrew Bible, this tendency would be rebutted. In other words, what Schechter is trying to do is argue for Jewish continuity, that there isn't an abrupt break between the old temple-centered Judaism and the later wisdom-centered Judaism. There isn't an abrupt break that suggests that that Hellenized Greek traditions are inauthentic and corrupt, and likewise that purity and ritual texts are divorced from wisdom traditions. He's trying to produce continuity and syncretism. Something very interesting, and I don't think that's in the, it's not in this PowerPoint, but in this same article, this early article published in 1896, published in a journal called The Expositor. Again, the article is called A Fragment of the Original Text of Ecclesiasticus. You can look it up. In this same article, he throws his readers off the scent by lying. He says that the fragment comes from Palestine. He writes, and this is a quote, "For this fragment, we are indebted to Agnes Smith Lewis and Margaret Dunlop Gibson's last journey in Palestine and Egypt." So he's not clear about where it comes from. "In which countries they have acquired various Hebrew manuscripts, mostly in fragments. Our fragment was found in the Palestine bundle, among other leaves of Hebrew manuscripts." And so it seems like this is intentional. He does not want to get into a race with other scholars to find more fragments like this one. He wants to get to the Genizah first. And indeed, he is in a race because he does have colleagues, especially at Oxford, who are trying to find out the source of the fragments that are arriving in Cambridge and Oxford in the early 1890s. Schechter's wife, Matilda, similarly is writing her friends about a very secret mission that her husband is on. And she writes Judge Mayer Salzberger in December of 1896. She says, "Mr. Schechter left England on the 16th of December." Again, this is in the PowerPoint, "where he was sent to by our university for purposes of research." And then she has in parentheses, "Hebrew manuscripts. As it is a secret mission, the fact will be announced in the University Reporter only after the commencement of next term." So there was a lot of intrigue, a lot of protection, a lot of discretion and secrecy when it comes to what happens next. And again, there are other scholars who've written about this. I highly recommend Marina Ristow, Rebecca Jefferson, Stephen Reif. There are many great scholars on how it came to be that Schechter, as opposed to many other scholars, was successful in getting permission to empty the Genizah and ship it in crates to Cambridge. For my purposes, it's important to know that he wasn't the first to see the Genizah. He wasn't the discoverer of the Genizah. He's often represented as that. It is incorrect. But he is the most successful in achieving what he aims to achieve, which is to make the contents of the Genizah accessible to scholars. And he's also the first scholar to really, I think, understand from the Jewish perspective how important the Genizah is, not only for the study of medieval Judaism, but also for the study of early Judaism and what is truly at stake. What's at stake is that this discovery gives him the opportunity to prove the integrity of his religion. I want to show you a few other documents that also were originally written in the Second Temple era that were found in the Genizah. And then I'll show you some other cool discoveries from the medieval period. Okay. Another document that was discovered at the Genizah is known as the Aramaic Levi or Levi document. This text was known to scholars in a very different version, but it was known to scholars in a Greek version, and it was thought to be Christian. The text that I'm talking about in Greek is called the Testament of Levi. The Testament of Levi is part of a collection of 12 documents called the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. This is a collection of 12 speeches uttered by the sons of Jacob on their deathbeds. And these speeches all try to convince the children of these patriarchs to be pious, to observe their ancestral laws, to study their Torah, to do all the things that they have to do in order to maintain God's good graces. As we have it today, the testaments of the 12 patriarchs include what we call interpolations, insertions that reference Jesus, the Trinity, that give the reader an indication that these texts were written by early Christians, or maybe one early Christian. But like the Greek version of Ben Sira, the testaments of the 12 patriarchs contain Semiticisms. In other words, they contain turns of phrase that sound much smoother in a Hebrew original. And scholars for years were wondering whether the Testaments of the 12 patriarchs were actually a collection of translations of Hebrew or Aramaic testaments that had been lost. And in fact, what was discovered in the Genizah was an Aramaic version of a testament, a scrap of an original Aramaic text that seems to have been a precursor to the Testament of Levi. And this was later confirmed at Qumran, at the Dead Sea Scrolls, where a larger set of fragments, all belonging to the Aramaic Levi document, was found. So here I'll show you the English translation. And if you were to see this, imagine that you're a Greek speaking Christian in the early Common Era. This actually might not look distinctively Jewish to you. And now, my children, I command you, fear the Lord your God with your whole heart, walk in generosity according to all his law, and you also ought to teach your children letters, in other words, how to read, that they may have an understanding all their life in order to read the law. That should be Torah, the Torah of God without ceasing, because anyone who will come to know the Torah of the Lord will be honored and will not be a stranger wherever he goes. He will gain many more friends than his parents, and many people will desire to serve him and to hear the law from his mouth. So this is the Aramaic version. And now I'll read to you the Greek version that scholars knew about. It's very similar. And this fragment that was found parallels the 13th chapter of the Testament of Levi that scholars knew about, again, the Greek version. That reads, now, my children, I command you, fear the Lord your God with your whole heart, walk according to his law in integrity, teach your children letters also, so that they might have understanding throughout all their lives as they ceaselessly read the law of God. So in other words, when scholars discovered the Aramaic version of this testament, they realized that this whole collection, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, probably has Jewish origins, even though it's a wisdom text, even though it looks highly Hellenized and it's philosophical and it's not particularly ritualistic. It was originally written by a Jew who spoke Aramaic and probably lived in the land of Israel. And like I said, this is very important to emphasize, it was not only discovered in the Genizah, it was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means it was a popular text. If we have two ancient fragments of the Testament of Levi, imagine how many hundreds of or thousands of documents were copied of this text that have been lost. I'm going to show you, I know we're running a little bit against the clock over here. I'll show you one other document that really flummoxed scholars. Oh, here, I actually had this, the Testament of Levi up here. Okay, there's another document that was discovered in the Genizah. It was produced in the medieval era, but it was originally composed in the Second Temple period. In other words, the manuscript is a 10th century manuscript, but it was composed in the Second Temple era. When scholars discovered it, they had no idea what it was. They were totally flummoxed. It seemed to be some kind of document about how a tiny community, a sect, should live. And they really did not know. Maybe this was a sectarian document from ancient times. Schechter thought maybe it came from a sect called the Sadducees. This document was preserved in two partial copies. It had two sections. The first was a kind of an admonition, a set of warnings about how to act and how not to act, a reference to the sect's early history and its ideology. And the second section is a series of laws of do's and don'ts on topics that would have been familiar to observant Jews, topics related to the Sabbath, civil law, purity, and impurity. But again, scholars really had no idea what to do with this document until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they also found a copy, multiple copies of the Damascus document as it became known, and realized that this document was a foundational text for the sect that lived at the Dead Sea. How in the world it made its way from the Dead Sea sect to Cairo. How did it come to be that a scribe in the 10th century copied over this text and then stored it in the Cairo Genizah remains a mystery. There have been suggestions and hypotheses. Maybe it traveled through Karaite communities that had inherited certain traditions from the Sadducees. But the truth is, we really don't know with certainty how it came to be that a manuscript of this document, which was considered foundational to a first century community in the Dead Sea, how did this end up in Cairo in the medieval era? We don't know, but that is what is part of what makes this collection fun. And here we have some passages from the Damascus document, but I'm not going to read this with you. I'm going to show you a few other really interesting Genizah texts that don't come from the Second Temple era, but that speak to the extraordinary breadth and depth of what we find in the Genizah, all mixed up together. Here are a few examples. Here we have a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a document that has a text written under another text, or a text written over an older text. And you can see, if you look very carefully, oh, hold on one second, oh no, you could see, let me zoom in there. You see writing under the Hebrew. Parchment was hard to come by for many scribes, and it was expensive. And sometimes it was more efficient and economical to use a previously used parchment and scratch out the ink and write over it. Actually, this happened all the time. Palimpsests are quite common when it comes to ancient manuscripts. And this manuscript has on the more recent text is poetry by the Paitan, the early medieval poet Yanai. And this comes from a mahzor, from a prayer book for the Jewish high holidays that includes Yanai's poetry. But what's really shocking here, and again, this speaks to how the Genizah is home for such a surprising encounter of cultures. The underscript is the New Testament and the Gospel of John, chapter 14. Not in Greek, but in a Palestinian Aramaic, in a dialect of Aramaic that early Christians use. How did it come to be that someone who, a scribe who loved and admired the poetry of Yanai, found or came across an old manuscript of the New Testament, scratched all out and wrote over it? Again, it's a mystery for the ages, but actually there are numerous palimpsests found in the Cairo Genizah. We have Origen's Hexapla, the 3rd century church father Origen, wrote this unbelievable, this document that translates the New Testament into various targums and translations. We have Origen's Hexapla under an Aramaic text of the Torah. So these things happen all the time, and we don't know exactly how, but they were discovered in the Genizah. Here we have a charming 12th century magical document, a charm. It says, excellent fortune has come to you. Good luck and a happy omen. Your fortune is on the increase every day in a pure new flourishing. Be thankful to God, and he will give you increase, for with him is the greatest increase. 12th century Arabic. And again, what is the background of this? We really don't know, but presumably it was owned by a Jew because it ends up in the Cairo Genizah. We also have, like I said at the beginning of the talk, we have dowry lists that list someone very, very wealthy, maybe someone prominent in the community from the 12th century. Look at all the things. This is only partial because I couldn't fit all of it into this PowerPoint, but this is only partial. And one of the interesting things about this Genizah is that in addition to including Hebrew texts that don't have God's name, they also have Judeo-Arabic and other languages somehow ended up in the Genizah. We have the last letter that the Rambam, that Maimonides' brother David writes to him before he dies tragically at sea. His ship sinks. He's a merchant who travels, and this is the last letter that that David writes to his brother Moses Maimonides. It's dated to 1170. Ironically, it is a letter about how he was very fortunate to avoid tragedy because he missed a certain caravan that was traveling somewhere, and that caravan ended up being robbed, and many people were killed. And he felt very fortunate to not be in that group of people who were attacked. And then shortly afterwards, very unfortunately, his ship sank, and he died. And here we have the letter. You could find it easily online. And here we have Schechter looking through the mass of fragments, so fragile, so tenuous, and here you can see how they were separated very carefully into little plastic folders, little plastic slips, and labeled. And this work is not done. Again, when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of documents, there are still documents that are not digitized and cataloged. The work continues. Coming to an end, here's the modern exterior of the Ben Ezra Synagogue. You can see this is not a medieval structure. It had been rebuilt and reconstructed numerous times, but this is the external view. And here is the Genizah that had been built in 1892 after the 3-year period of reconstruction. That is the Genizah that Schechter climbed into. And again, it likely contained many thousands of fragments that had recently been deposited there from other Genizot in the city because it was very large, the space was very large, and presumably the leaders of the synagogue felt that it had more capacity and was perhaps more secure than other Genizot in the city. And so they added from other parts of the town. And these are 2 helpful links if you want to learn more. I would suggest that you especially go to the first one. This is the major digitization project of the Genizot, and you can see a lot of these online. And so with that, I'm going to stop my share. And just to sum up, and then we can take some questions. I think sometimes when we talk about the Cairo Genizah, we have a certain association with medieval Egyptian Jewry. And the truth is that the origin story of the Genizah really is even more expansive than that. And its discovery helped us rethink the very origins of the Jewish people and what it means to explore those early years before the rise of Rabbinic Judaism. I know that we have a lot of questions here, and I'm not going to get to all of them. I'm going to do this a little bit on the fly. The 2 Scottish ladies are the subject of a wonderful book, The Sisters of Sinai. It's an outstanding book, and I do recommend it. How common was the name Yeshua? Very common. It has nothing to do with Jesus. The Yeshua is like Yehoshua, very, very common name. How do we know that the Hebrew version preceded the Greek version and it is not a translation from the Greek to Hebrew? This is a great question, but the style of Hebrew does correspond well with the dialect of Hebrew from the 2nd century BCE. So it looks pre-rabbinic and not rabbinic. And again, it's much smoother in the Hebrew in parts than in the Greek. And that prologue seems to be a genuine, authentic prologue, which reliably dates the original composition to 180 BCE. Someone wrote something very interesting. I'm just reading this together with you. I visited the Ben Ezra Synagogue in 1987. Wow. It seemed semi-abandoned at the time. I asked the caretaker about the Genizah, so he took me to a mausoleum-like structure. Wow. Yes, actually, I'm glad that you're writing this because I have something to say about it. Behind the synagogue, an open pit contained thousands of prayer books. I'm really glad, anonymous attendee, that you're talking about this. Total chaos, but in excellent condition. I forgot to mention this. When the synagogue was renovated in the 1890s, some of the collectors who were going to the synagogue to try to obtain manuscripts and sell them to Oxford and Cambridge reported that there were mounds of ancient fragments dumped to the side and in the back of the synagogue, and many of them were buried. And we don't know to this day whether there are still thousands of fragments buried under the earth. Not necessarily because of disrespect, but because that is one way to preserve and dispose of Genizah documents. And so the mystery continues. Are there still fragments there? Likely, yes. Would it be incorrect to read undermining of Judaism and or supersessionism in the idea that Jewish wisdom texts are separate from ritual and purity? This seems like the kind of anti-Semitic thinking that Rabbi Shai Held has been teaching about. Well, that's exactly correct. The notion that there is a binary between texts that highlight how to act properly, how to behave in an ethical and moral way, and on the other hand, what we might call a priestly tradition is a false binary. Again, this comes from a Protestant thinking that pits priests against prophets and imagines the prophets of old as being marginal and on the edges of Israelite society and shunned by the priests who are very possessive of their power and lie kind of at the center of cultic life. This association of priests with the cult and prophets with ethics enforces a false binary that did not exist. And we know that it didn't exist because if you look at the Tanakh, you'll see that there were court prophets. Isaiah and other prophets were very close with the kings of Israel and Judah. And so this notion of priests versus prophets, it really is very problematic. And it's important to study Greek Jewish texts in conversation with Hebrew ones and vice versa, noting that they all come from a common well of tradition and values that are not in tension with one another. How old is the Aramaic Levite document? It's a great question. Probably first century BCE. And we also know that there are other testaments from the testaments of the 12 patriarchs that have an original Aramaic version. I believe that there's an Aramaic version of Naphtali that was found in the Dead Sea caves, also paleographically dated to the first century BCE, which makes us think that there were Jews writing in Aramaic in the land of Israel in the first century BCE, imagining what these patriarchs said to their children on their deathbed. And even though these are highly ethical texts, very philosophical, and almost look like Greek wisdom texts, they're written in Aramaic by observant Jews who were likely devoted to their temple, to ritual, to their ancestral traditions. So probably the first century BCE. Why wasn't Ben Sira canonized? Well, it's a question because I'm going to question that premise. I think that it's likely that many Jews in the late Second Temple era did view Ben Sira as authoritative. Canonized, maybe not. Authoritative, scriptural, probably. The rabbis indeed are citing Ben Sira as authoritative, but because of its late date, it doesn't really stand a chance to make it into the Tanakh, especially if it was translated into Greek so quickly after it was produced and then primarily circulating among Jews in Greek. It wasn't going to be canonized if it was known primarily as a Greek text that was produced in the Hellenistic era. So I think its late date just kind of takes it out of the picture, and yet it is revered and admired and cited. Can we get the full PowerPoint? Absolutely. Send me an email, msimkovich@jps.org. Simkovich does not have a T. I will happily send you my PowerPoint. Could references to Ben Sira in the Talmud also indicate that it was originally written in Hebrew rather in Greek? Yes, 100%. And that is what Schechter is arguing, that it was originally written in Hebrew, and the rabbis are treating it as a Hebrew text. If it was to them known primarily as a Greek text, maybe they would have been less inclined. I'm not sure how much more to go here, so I will defer to our wonderful moderators or organizers of tonight's event So I don't know, Matt, if I should keep going here. But there's a lot of wonderful questions.
Yeah, I'm happy for you to keep answering questions as long as you for the next few minutes, as long as you see questions that are relevant and interesting.
Sure. Okay. Um, so do any of the Cairo documents prove that Jews were in Egypt as the story of Joseph described? No, but there were many traditions about Joseph produced in Egypt by Jews living in Egypt in the Second Temple era. And those documents were extraordinarily popular. I don't know if any of them verify to your satisfaction the biblical story of Joseph. Um, what percentage is in Cambridge? A couple 100,000. I saw this number. I think it's a little more than half. You'd have to ask. You can look on the website, or you could reach out to Stephen Reif, who's one of the major scholars on this topic. But part of the problem is that we can't determine a percentage when we don't know exactly how many fragments are in the Genizah or should be treated as a Genizah fragment. Like I just said, how many thousands are buried? How many thousands of fragments are buried outside the synagogue, but in the grounds of the synagogue? How many fragments were brought to the Genizah in 1892, but really weren't stored there? So you'll find numbers ranging from 240,000 to 400,000 when it comes to how many fragments were found in the Genizah. So already, if you don't know if it's 240,000 or 400,000, you can't really determine percentages. But this is a huge question. Are these Second Temple writings originally written during the Second Temple period, or are they copies written hundreds of years later? Okay, if they are from ancient times, then where were they prior to the establishment of the Genizah? So the manuscripts are medieval, but we know that they are copies of documents that were authored, that were originally composed in the Second Temple era. That is what Schechter intuited. That is what other Jewish scholars who began to work with these texts intuited. But it was really confirmed with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because those scrolls are known to be primarily from the 1st century BC, and some of them even earlier. And so once you find Aramaic Levite document in the Dead Sea caves, and once you find the Damascus documents in the Dead Sea caves and Ben Sira, then you have your proof. So again, the manuscripts from the Genizah are medieval. They weren't actually physically written by Jews in the Second Temple era, but they are copies of documents that were composed about 1,000 years earlier. How this transmission history took place exactly, we cannot know. That's part of the fun mystery of this collection. We don't know. How did it come to be? There are a number of communities that make it to Cairo from eastern regions. There's a Babylonian Jewish community that thrived in Cairo, and there are also Karaites, Jews who do not accept the authority of the oral tradition. And these Karaites view themselves as inheritors of the tradition perpetuated by the ancient Sadducees. This is a sect in the late Second Temple era that also rejected the authority of rabbinic law. And so perhaps the Damascus document was a Sadducean document that was preserved and transmitted and copied by later Karaites, and then those Karaites go to Cairo and put the Damascus document into the Genizah. That is one theory, and it's a very plausible theory. Can I prove it? No, we can't. Are there other Genizahs even older than the Cairo Genizah? I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure that we can date, but there are other storage, there are other kind of storage facilities. In other words, there are monasteries that contain ancient Jewish texts that are older than the Genizah. St. Catherine's Monastery, I wouldn't call it a Genizah, but St. Catherine's Monastery from the 5th or 6th century is collecting ancient texts, which include documents that were originally written by Jews. And monasteries play a huge role in the modern recovery of ancient Jewish texts. Who would have thought it? Except that monks were literate and revered the written word, and many of them had scribal training, and so they copied these ancient texts. Okay, I think I can do this. Can I put my email address in the Q&A? Yes, I can. It says type your answer, so I'm just going to do it here. Hopefully everyone will see it, Simkovich at jps.org. Okay. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out, but I highly recommend the scholarship of Rebecca Jefferson, Stephen Reif, Marina Rustow, and many others. If you have questions about Second Temple literature, then I would, very, uh, I guess, audaciously suggest that I can confidently answer your questions. But there are many wonderful scholars on the Cairo Genizah and on its modern recovery, and I suggest that you go find their scholarship as well. Thank you very much for coming, and I really appreciate the opportunity again to learn with all of you.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Professor Simkovich, for sharing all of this fascinating learning. Your presentation was really wonderful, and tackling all of these insightful questions from our audience. It's really amazing how much we can learn from the uncovery of these texts and how it really shaped our understanding of Jewish history and really maybe how much more there is to learn out there. So
Yes, that's what's amazing is we don't even know what hasn't been discovered. If this is what has been discovered, imagine exponentially what was produced and then lost.